How do you relate with the injustices of the world and the suffering that we see on television, that we read about, that maybe we see in our home countries? It's a bit of a dilemma for me, because one part is saying that you have to let go and accept it for what it is. And then there's another part of me that is socially responsible, I guess, or feels the responsibility towards others. So if we were to let go, where does our responsibility towards others lie?
Mm-hmm. So it seems like there is a thread of questions, right? That a thread. It's not just a simple one question, right? Where our responsibility lies if we let go. And also you asking how did you say how do I feel with regard to the injustice and
yeah, how are we supposed to
how do we suppose? Okay,
yeah,
because I thought you were asking me personally.
do we relate to it? Do we find another way to look at it? I don't know.
As it is always particularly with the questions like this, there is a so-called safer territory, which it is, to go into that kind of political correctness, which, interestingly, spirituality, very often, when I say that, in spiritual circles, often considered to be a proper way of dealing with it, right? It's not as straightforward. So, again, we cannot apply here one size fits all in terms of our attitude, in terms of our understanding of what we experience. We have to be always honest with ourselves. So this is already, I would say, a rule of thumb. First of all, we have to be honest with our responses, honest with how something impacts or affects us. So this is already, I would say, a suggestion or a given, because otherwise there is an invitation, or always an invitation, or a possibility for a form of bypassing, because it's easier not to get involved. And also maybe it's not so much easier, but somehow it feels safer not to get involved. And we may not want to get involved for a variety of reasons. We're not going to begin to mention them now, because each and every one will have a justified set of reasons not to. We leave it at that. What is, however, important here in terms of our personal growth, in terms of our personal, let's say, evolution, is, as I have said, first of all, to be honest with our responses within ourselves. In other words, having the full acknowledgement when something affects us, including when something doesn't affect us, when we feel we cannot be bothered, or we feel that somehow we give preference, and it's very often, by the way, very often is the case. Why? Because everything, when it comes to the levels of information, is one or another form of, we could say, manipulation. In a way, we could say that the age of information is inseparable from manipulating minds towards certain stand. Ever since the necessity arose to come up with a certain set of ideologies, ideas, the so-called collectively coherent set of ideations, a collectively shared consensus. There was always a need to maintain that. I don't want to begin to mix apples and pears, but even in terms of religious ideologies, religious institutions utilize that already to quite a successful degree for a prolonged period of time to maintain the primacy for the content of information and how it meant to be interpreted. The primal example is the Council at Nicaea. Prior to the Council of Nicaea, and there were several, and I'm giving this maybe historical high example, and then we'll come to our day and age. But you know the Council of Nicaea, right? You've heard about it. No. Anybody else? Council of Nicaea? All right, let me just give a quick crash history for God's sake. For Christ's sake, in this case, will be really fitting. So, Christ was a teacher. He was a Messiah, maybe just a rabbi. He was a teacher, he taught. We don't know how long, this and that. We have this, what came as a result of what was agreed at some point at so-called event known as Council at Nicaea. It's a place, geographical place which was part of the Roman Empire back then, somewhere in North Africa, where everyone was summoned up and the council was held. So every whatever position one held in any of the community would have to be there to represent that so as to adhere to a new set of interpretations of what the story of Christ meant to represent. Prior to that, in other words, prior to the Council of Nicaea, there were a variety of ways of how various early Christian communities interpreted Christ's teaching. Just ponder on that for a moment. Just ponder on that for a moment. Somewhere in, let's say, I don't know, in Cappadocia in Turkey, there was these communities that had that interpretation. Somewhere in the south of France, another interpretation. Deep down in the pockets of, back then still pretty much intact, right? Disintegrating, but still Roman Empire, right? That is now being forged into another empire. There were Christian communities spread all over, spread deep into the Middle East, deep into contemporary Eastern Europe and Russia and Ukraine, deep into Europe and Africa, North Africa mostly. Each carrying their own interpretations of Christ's teaching, each having the rights to maintain set of doctrines based on how they see the teaching. You see? Then comes the Council at Nicaea. No more all these frivolities. It's going to be organized now because it's becoming a prevalent religion. It's now being institutionalized. And already it wasn't institutionalized. So institutionalization of Christianity happened before Council at Nicaea. Council at Nicaea was the next step. Now we have acknowledged that this is indeed this new teaching, this branching, spreading, thriving communities, because apparently they were thriving, need to be organized. And the Council at Nicaea, and why it is known, when you go home today, please Google, so you don't just take all this for granted, and you will see Council at Nicaea, and you will see there were several of them. But they are known for coming up with a consensus on what is considered to be a legitimate story of Christ and a legitimate teaching of Christ. And there is a term which is inseparable from the councils of Nicaea, known as blasphemy. You know that term, blasphemy, right? It's a strong religious connotations term which is used today in the language as well, right? Blasphemy is what?
When you deny God.
Yes, exactly. Blasphemy is something which is essentially utter, the opposite of the religious truth, we could say. Blasphemy. So the term blasphemy is inseparable from the Council of Nicaea and what have been decided. Because in other words, anything that falls short of the interpretation which was set as the one and only way to interpret Christ's teaching. In other words, who Christ was, was fixed from there and then. Anything else? Blasphemy. Okay? I don't want to go now into the whole turning into the, although maybe that's where the bow tie would have worked perfectly. It's like giving you a whole history now. Yeah, now it's like Council of Nicaea. We can have now a way of actually calling people, excuse me, so you've been doing your, hanky-panky in that part of Europe, in your community. I've heard that you are still talking about this as if you think you're God knows whom. You know that this is blasphemy? You're paying taxes? Well, that's not enough. On the stakes. And giving you to the fire. Or tying a stone to your chest with few, almost equals to your weight of your body, and throwing into water. If you float, that means that, there's some kind of wickedness. If you drown, okay, well, tough. So basically, this is, in a nutshell, speaking in that sarcastic way of how a certain collectively shared consensus was given to be considered to be one and the only truth. And the example, why I gave this, or why I chose this as an example, because it may be not as dramatic today, who knows, maybe not, but it still plays intact when it comes to what we consider to be true or false, what we consider to be just or not, when it comes to a lot of events that take place in the world. So when we hear of injustice, before we jump into conclusions, we need to be in the possession of as much on the topic, on the subject, as we possibly can. Because if we judge any situation, whether this is minute situation that happened here and now, or the situation that, let's say, has the global level of nations, right, where the national interests, where all this is at stake, lives of people above all else, freedom, and so forth. We have to see at all that what is being at play. And a lot is being at play usually. So of course, then it takes us to the next level, because first we were feeling injustice just at the obvious, blatant state of affairs. We dug deeper, and we have more now in view, and it feels even more stinky than before. It feels even more rotten. No? If we look at some of the real roots of certain conflicts that are being masterminded. Like, for example, I have nothing to do against my cousin, and he has nothing against me. Or her, maybe, and we're cousins, right? But once someone decides to set us apart, and they find reasons, they're in the history line, in no time we had this neutral, normal, whatever relationship. It becomes to be antagonistic. Because someone finds it's, for whatever reason, interested in us having a conflict. See, I'm not going to go into the reasons, right? Of course, I can just blatantly say, well, the biggest conflicts are, if we are to follow the thread of who benefits the most, comes to, let's say, if it's a war, then it must be a war machine. And who benefits the most? And why and how? And we're sitting here in Germany right now, and we know that it took a while, several months, before European leaders realized that they've been played, and played dirtily. right? So that now the conversation is like, oh, we're going to take United States government and Biden's administration to the court for what they've done to us, because we are now having to buy resources, which we were actually getting much cheaper before, but now being sold to us. I don't know, maybe we read different newspapers, log into different devices or like different sources of information, but that's what I've heard. And I'm just giving it as an example, you see? It's not that I'm kind of invested into it myself personally. It's still following that example. First, honest with our responses and reactions. Then, before we judge any side, we need to see what is actually happening. So in other words, we want to be in the possession of different sides of the story. You see? Maybe from that angle, it's that, you know? But there are different angles, and I want to see it from every side. And maybe it will begin to present a different picture, a fuller picture somehow. And even then, when we come to that, we may be in for greater revelations in terms of actually, let's say now use that as a sort of a way of the language, where the greater evil hides, once we begin to trace this. And that is, of course, not where we stop. Because what is the most important is how do we reconcile that in our own psyche? How do we understand that in the fullness of the capacity of our own consciousness? You see? This is what's so important. After all this, it has to come to this understanding and realization. Provided, of course, we have an ideological or philosophical platform to understand this. Because if we don't, if let's say our platform is not rooted in equanimity, equality, oneness, unified field of what unites us all beyond the differences, then we might feel it's more appropriate to have the stand where there are forces of evil and forces of goodness. There are forces of evil, and that we have to be very attentive here, because this is the most important area, because that's what truly split our psyche apart. This is what creates tremendous havoc at a deep level, because it separates us within. It creates this hell already there and then. Even if it runs on or propelled by the righteousness of the moment of how we interpret the situation, given all this, what was just as that line of inquiry. We arrive at that must be forces of goodness and forces of evil. Where am I? Of course, I am with the forces of goodness, and all that must be evil in the world. And that evil took hold on, and this is where, in no time, we end up in a split situation, which actually split us. Split us. It split the very core of who we are. So, if we don't have that understanding, it's very easy to split us. You see? That there must be some evil forces or evil people, you know? Evil, they're evil. And there are people who are goodness, they're goodness exemplified, they're godly people. And it potentially creates that strongest sense of separation that there is within ourselves. Because instead of an opportunity, and every encounter like that is an opportunity to see the true state of affairs, where we recognize that certain disparity, certain ways of how at the manifested level of creation, how it presents itself with, at times, unbearable, even catastrophic picture of how human beings can behave towards each other. At the very same time, we know that the core of every human being, absolutely every human being, is a very, very light of the same awareness that I am. And that all there is, and that is the ultimate truth of the situation. And it is within me, within myself, that I can feel that in a tactile manner. So it's not just a philosophical, cold concept. It's a warm concept. It's a very warm concept. Warm as that heart-warming. It's accompanied by a true sense of surrender into that, what here this realization represents. Whilst at the very same time, you see, this is also very important. At the very same time, we do not put a blind eye or sluggish into this sort of complete and utter state of denial that at the level of manifestation there is a lot of injustice. Why? Because this is how, right now, certain energies in the world play themselves out. Why that is, I have no capacity to understand, but I'm humbled at the capacity to reconcile it within myself, because I do have that capacity. And if I can reconcile it within myself, maybe it can be reconciled in those in whom that is rendered these beings asunder. And if that is possible within me, it is possible in someone else. And if it's possible in someone else, it's like a chain reaction. It's like works at the level of, it's contagious. So going now all the way to the end of your question, where is our primal responsibility? Our primal responsibility, as far as I can see it, is always in what is in our capacity. You see? What is in our capacity? And it is in our capacity to reconcile that, because we are, by virtue of our birth, nothing short of being that what all this is and has always been, awareness. It knows no other. It's always one with everything. And at the same time remaining vigilant in terms of whether this is true, whether that capacity is utilized, exercised. Otherwise, it is more true. This has to be understood and taken without jumping into conclusions. Otherwise, it's more important to fully feel and go through that what maybe tore us apart at a certain time, at a certain moment in our life. You see? Because I would not advocate at all cost, sort of like all this is just oneness and very dangerous if it's not fully felt. Because if it's at the expense of cold sort of determination of mental activity, which refuses to feel the gravity of the situation, simply because it actually doesn't have that capacity to begin with. It's not coming out of compassion. It's coming out of the brittleness of cold surface, which doesn't know how to relate. We can't afford that. And it is for you to know where it applies, because it's only you who knows. no one else. You see? Otherwise, there's more integrity in the righteous fury. There's more integrity in that fury that can bring us closer to that what we are. But what we cannot afford is that detachment which comes not out of compassion and all-embracing qualities, but detachment that comes out of the cold surface of our incapacity to correlate, worth nothing. It's not detachment, it's a pretense. So therefore I say I'm in for fury. So therefore when they rise and when there's fury, I'm with these people. As awareness which knows no other, I'm with those, you see, with the underdog, with the ones who had enough, not with the, oh, let's just like do our japa mala here, you know, safely sitting here like philosophizing. I'm just saying that is not the shape of my heart, as the singer sang, you see? This is not how it sits here. Therefore, always we have to remain true to what we are. And in this case, fury has greater spiritual dimension than that cold surface, so-called detachment. You see? Because that all-encompassing qualities that come out of sheer realization of oneness, sheer realization of all that, all there is, has a very different quality. It holds this world in warmth, and it's not blind to injustice, to atrocities. It holds it always.